Bliss and Grit is an entirely listener-supported show. Supporting us is also designed to support you through keeping the episodes rolling, but also through rewards for your donation, like a Getting Started guide, a private forum, and downloadable meditations. To become a supporting member, you can visit patreon.com/Bliss and Grit.
Hello, beautifuls. You're listening to Bliss and Grit. I'm Vanessa Scotto, and I'll be joined soon by my dear friend and co-host, Brooke Thomas. On the show, we're talking about being on the embodied spiritual path. And what does that actually mean? What is a real evolution of our lives? How do we ultimately embrace everything? All the beauty and crazy, the joys and the messes, the bliss and the grit that is a human life. Today, we are blessed to be sharing with you a conversation that we had with our special guest, Dorothy Hunt. Dorothy serves as spiritual director of Moon Mountain Sangha and is the founder of the San Francisco Center for Meditation and Psychotherapy. Inspired by the legendary sage Ramana Maharshi and modern-day teacher Adyashanti, she's the author of several books, including her latest book, Ending the Search, From Spiritual Ambition to the Heart of Awareness. Dorothy currently offers meditation and satsang gatherings, weekend intensives and retreats, and also sees individuals for both psychotherapy and for what's called dokusan, a private meeting with a spiritual teacher. For more on Dorothy, please visit dorothyhunt.org. In today's conversation, we explore with Dorothy what the term awakening means to her and what it might look like to end the search. We also speak on unconditional versus conditional love, how we can come closer to our true identity, what it means to be fully human, and so much more. We're so glad that you're joining us to experience the openness in this beautiful, heartfelt conversation with Dorothy Hunt. If you're enjoying the show, we are always so delighted when people leave reviews on iTunes or our Facebook page, which is Bliss and Grit. It not only feels really great to us to connect with you, but it helps people find the show. You can also head over to blissandgrit.com, that's our website, to email us, to subscribe to get our weekly digest, or to become a supporting member on our Patreon platform. Okay, everyone, here we go.
Hi, Brooke.
Hi, Vanessa.
We are so excited to introduce all of you to Dorothy Hunt. Dorothy is someone who we've been getting to know via her new book and enjoying so much. And Brooke and I I'm speaking for you, Brooke, are just brimming with enthusiasm for this conversation. So, like all conversations where I'm utterly excited, I will probably feel nervous the first couple of moments. So, all of you bear with me. Welcome, Dorothy. We're so happy to have you here.
Well, thank you so much, and thanks for the invitation. I'm happy to be with the two of you as well.
Okay, Dorothy, we thought that a good place to start this conversation could be to discuss what we're talking about when we use the term awakening, because like most words, it seems to be co-opted and it's used so differently by different people. I read people on social media saying, ever since my awakening, which seems to mean to some people, ever since I realized I'm more than my thoughts, or ever since I realized energy existed. And then I think some of us have an idea that awakening is like that old school vision of enlightenment that we got from the Eastern sages of a unaffected person sitting up in the mountaintops. That was actually my first view of awakening. So I thought it could be a great place to share with the listeners what you mean when you refer to awakening.
Mm-hmm. Well, you are so right that different people, different traditions, and different experiences will define awakening in very different ways. For me, an authentic awakening always carries with it a shift of identity. So there are many different types of awakenings. There's awakening out of the identification with the body-mind into a transcendent realm. We might call that awakening of the head in terms of the insight into we are more than just this body-mind. Doesn't mean we're excluding it, but, we are this awareness, this awakeness that pervades life and is perceiving really every single experience of our life as well as whatever else is going on in the world. And then, there's an awakening of the heart, which is a different experience. That's an awakening to our oneness with life, with one another, with the divine, with nature, with whatever. And then there's a deeper awakening yet, which in my teaching and Adyashanti's, who is one of my teachers, there's an awakening of the hara, which is this deep gut place that really holds the clench of separate identity, and that's something that either lets go or it doesn't. There's nothing to do to force that, but it's a deeper awakening yet. So, people have different experiences at different times, but like I said in the beginning, I think ultimately they come to a shift of identity so that we know ourselves as actually what we were seeking. If we were seeking enlightenment, if we were seeking God, if we were seeking divine presence, if we were seeking love, we eventually discover when this wakes up to itself that we are what we were hoping to find out there. It's really inside. So that would be a thumbnail sketch.
Yeah, it's tough to put into a thumbnail. Thank you. That's a very, very helpful frame and very clear. And the title of your book is Ending the Search, From Spiritual Ambition to the Heart of Awareness. And so I think in some ways another sort of zoom out bird's eye view that's worth talking about is defining what seeking is, because a lot of what you're talking about is sort of seeing with clarity the seeking mechanism, I could say, and letting it go. So how would you define what you mean by seeking? Obviously, on a spiritual path is what we're referencing.
Yes. Well, as I mentioned in the book, authentic seeking for our true nature, for truth, for the divine, whatever it is that we're seeking on the spiritual plane, it actually comes from an impulse that's deep inside. It's planted there by its own source, we could say. So, seeking that's really authentic is coming from that impulse. Now, what happens is that the mind imagines that because there's an impulse to seek what we long for or what we don't think is already here, that then it has to go someplace else to find it. And so sometimes it takes a long time to turn the looking around and actually get interested in who the seeker is. Seeking will happen naturally, and it's not about that being wrong at all. The desire for happiness or God or whatever it is, it's our deepest longing. But we have the mistaken idea that because we long for something, we don't have it. And so one of the things that I would encourage any listener to do who has that longing is to follow the longing backwards to its source. And we will find if we stick with it that love is longing for itself. Awakeness is wanting to awaken, in its own experience of being.
Yeah, one of the things that I felt like you illustrated really beautifully in your book was that there is this unfolding, right? Like you were saying that this is deeply a part of ourselves and it's not a problem. And so maybe another way we could describe how it goes, this journey, if you want to call it that, is that sometimes things unfold. Or there's a section in your book where you wrote, what is needed will appear. And I've certainly had that experience with many things, and the more and more in touch with my true nature that I get, the more I find that that's just always available. But, the right teacher at the right time, or the right book, or obviously just the right noticing, that I come back from whatever mental gymnastics I was involved in, and I notice how nice the warm water feels on my hands when I'm washing dishes. But it can also be these really very, very meaningful people or relationships or experiences as well. So so most of us are caught in our separate selves and in our ego, right? So if that's most of us, what are some ways we might be able to differentiate when a genuine teaching is unfolding or like arriving for us versus that grabbing out there, I need to get over there seeking thing?
Well, I think you just described it in a sense when you said, the more I'm in touch with this deeper, these aren't exactly your words, but the more I'm in touch with this deeper dimension of myself or of being, the more I discover that things will come when they're needed, and I think that when we begin to trust ourself, our deeper self, however it is we experience it, whether or not we've had an experience called awakening, what we are is already awake in each one of us. It's already present in each one of us. It's been present to every experience of our life. We think that because our mind is so active and we're always listening to the narrator, the commentator, commenting on the passing scene, sometimes pretty much thing, that somehow we're located in that voice. But, when you really go to look for, is there really a separate entity in that voice? Or is it just thoughts, spewing thought, And it doesn't mean it's wrong, but to look into the source of thinking, we will come back to, well, gosh, I don't really know how thought arises. Even if I'm engaged in a scientific exploration, there still are sort of mysteries about why this one or that one, right? And so, to become kind of interested in who is the thinker, because consciousness itself has identified with the body-mind. It's not as though a body-mind is separate from what's animating it, from the life spirit that we have if we're living in form. But that consciousness, it's kind of like to my way of thinking, simplistic, but it's like a painter who falls in love with the painting, and fails to see that, the canvas on which it was painted was always there. It was always present. It was always, the background, we might say, to whatever foreground occurs. So yeah, I think that to really come into a relationship with what we are, we keep seeing what we're not, and then we think, well, we failed or we're too much in our mind or whatever. But to get interested in what's perceiving your mind, that's something that's prior to the thought, or at least we could say it can't be separated from the thought if you're aware of it, so we get more interested in what's aware, what's awake, than in how do I get rid of my thoughts.
I had this moment, Dorothy, that's coming to mind as you're speaking. I remember it was nothing in particular. I was just driving some normal route I always take, and I was having these self-critical thoughts spin through my mind, and I had this epiphany in this moment. It's hard to even describe, but sort of like, why am I being so hard on myself? I never decided what to think. I never decided what I would believe or who I was. I never sat down and wrote like, well, Vanessa will be insecure, for example. And there was like this big release as I mean, laughing and laughing. Brooke and I are both prone to laughing when we have a whiff of truth come our way, and and yet, then you can notice how the habit of believing there's a problem to be solved by the mind comes back in so strongly.
Oh, indeed.
Oh, it's just,
one of the things I think that we can learn, and the laughter part is great, because when you really see through the antics of your mind, it is kind of humorous, that the mind appears to love to make a problem and then try to solve it. It's kind of ephemeral, and it's maintaining itself as the God or the master, as if it were in charge. But, as you were saying, now, I didn't choose this thought, how did this come about, and kind of just seeing through the conditioned mind. It doesn't mean conditioned mind will immediately disappear, but we just see it for what it is instead of seeing it for who we are. And that's a huge difference. And then the more we see what you yourself saw, the more transparent that mind becomes. Does it mean it will never arise again? No, it doesn't mean that. But it gets quieter and quieter, in a sense, when we don't believe everything it's spewing forth. So paying attention to how, in what ways, our habit patterns are so deeply ingrained, right? And to look into them, not even to get rid of them, but to see clearly, and that itself is so transformative.
What's ironic is, in those moments, it feels extremely relieving as we recognize the truth that our ego was never really in control. Like, we were never really doing anything that we think we're doing. It can feel extremely relieving, and yet somehow it can also feel really scary, and we can be really resistant. And even the teaching of non-seeking, and I mean, you wrote a whole book on it, so there's so much we can say about what it means to release the habit of seeking. Even that beautiful teaching, I know for me, when I've been the most in pain or the most frustrated, and I've heard, don't seek, release seeking, it was like, I just felt like, I was so upset, I was so frustrated, because it's almost like that feeling like something wants to shift so bad, and you're kind of like stuck mid-motion, and it's so hard not to imagine that there's something I could do to control this and make it better. And I know that you teach, and you also see clients privately with your psychotherapy practice. And I wonder if you bump up against this sense of frustration around non-seeking. And if you do, what would you offer to someone who says, is there nothing I can do to alleviate my own suffering or to meet my desire to know my wholeness more?
Well, first of all, I would hope that readers don't read my book with the idea that it's about not seeking. I mean, we are always seeking until we don't, so part of the search is part of this unfolding that you speak about, that you spoke of a moment ago. It's not, I have to stop seeking. What I would propose that is maybe a more beneficial mode of seeking is to seek the true identity of the seeker. So there is a lot in the book about self-inquiry, which can happen, it might feel intellectual at first for people, but at least for me, it was, it would just happen spontaneously. Who's sitting with her client? Who's looking in the mirror? Who's wanting this moment to be different? And it turns our looking around toward the seeker as opposed to seeking something out there to answer the question or whatever. But that doesn't mean that we don't deal with suffering or that we don't hope to have an end of suffering if we are suffering. There's nothing wrong with seeking some end to suffering or some relief from suffering. But to seek the end of suffering is not necessarily the same as seeking the truth. So when we want truth more than we want our life or life itself to look a certain way, then I think truth begins to reveal itself more and more. Usually we're looking to be someplace else. If in fact, if I fall and break my leg, I certainly am going to seek somebody who knows how to fix a broken bone. I'm not going to sit there and say, oh, don't seek an end to this pain. The life will unfold naturally, and it always has. And that's what you were speaking about just a moment ago, to know that, it's just happening doesn't mean that seeking isn't just happening as well. And we will seek until there's an end to seeking. And that comes, for us when we really have those moments of knowing something that's a mystery, and yet it's what we are, or having that insight like you had in the car, like, oh my gosh, there was just something so relieving to be outside of the tyranny or the prison of our minds. So I'm not sure. You had a kind of a long question there, so I'm not.
No, you answered it beautifully, wonderfully. Thank you, Dorothy.
You did speak about, the practice of therapy and conditioning and so forth. And so what I would say about that is that when we invite our awareness, just our simple awareness, into the energy of a contraction or the energy of a painful or negative feeling, the energy of rage, the energy of fear, rather than how do I get rid of it. When we just invite, I will say to people, our awareness has no boundaries. It can go anywhere. So can you first locate, let's say someone's feeling anger. Where in your body are you feeling that? Energetically. And they'll locate it usually, sometimes in the gut, and so could we just invite awareness into that without any attempt to change it? Because our awareness, this is an aside, I don't necessarily always say this, but, our awareness is not separate from the moment. We can't separate the moment from our awareness. It's like, there's a lot of spiritual teaching. Oh, all the things are like clouds passing, and the sky is not affected. That is true, but do we know that the clouds and the sky are made of the same stuff? And that to me is the true non-dual understanding that the expressions of life are not separate from the source of life. The awareness, the heart of awareness out of which life operates, out of which, life emerges moment to moment to moment to moment. So when we invite awareness into the experience, not the storyline so much. We can go back to the story if we want to, but, when we work, and you were saying you're interested in the somatic, aspects of our life, when we invite awareness right into the energy of a moment, almost immediately there's a softening because we're no longer separate from it. And then from there, we can see what wants to happen. And sometimes, there'll be something revealed, or there'll be a memory that will come up, or it will just disappear. But the idea is not necessarily to keep transcending our experience, but to actually discover in the deeper phases of our so-called spiritual journey, discover what they're made of. Discover that they, like everything else, really are empty of separation. They're empty of a separate self. And as soon as we're not identifying this as something that a me should not be feeling because it means I'm not awake, or it means I'm not who I thought I was, or it means I'm deficient or unworthy, as soon as we stop attaching a me to the energy of the moment, it's a different relationship with it, and we can look more deeply.
Yeah, and I think what you're describing points to quite a lot of faith in a really beautiful way. Faith that I think to the separate self, it can seem crazy or outlandish that if you meet the moment directly, that there is this intelligence or this movement that will take care of itself.
Well, it is. It's counterintuitive, but here, this would be a really simple little experiment for you to do, or any of your listeners. Just make a fist, really tight fist with one hand, and you feel the tension of that contraction, and then you just let it rest on your other open palm, just the openness of your other hand. So these are two dimensions of your own body, and we could say, what's open and awake is just a deeper dimension of our own body as being, and you just let that fist rest in that open hand. and see what happens. And just see what happens. And almost invariably, something begins to soften. And we're not prying it apart. We're not trying to tell the story. It shouldn't be here. It shouldn't be what it is. We're just letting it touch this open heart or open palm or open mind, whatever openness you want to call it. And there may be more that needs to happen. I'm not saying it's always that simple, but that's the starting place. That's the starting.
It's a beautiful
and then awareness will begin to open things up from the inside. Our egoic mind is always attacking something as an object out there that we need to do something with, we need to get rid of or manipulate or whatever. But, the awareness that's not separate from this moment, this contraction, this, whatever emotion, it has a different trajectory of transforming things.
In the past year for me, like two of the themes that have surprised me and have, keep emerging are ordinariness as this really beautiful, sacred thing, and also contentment. Like, I hadn't been aware of how much structuring I had, like how phobic I was of contentment. Like, contentment was just this foreign planet to discover.
Well, that's a liberation, isn't it?
Yeah.
To discover that. Yeah, I think a lot of us, some people have grown up with a lot of fear, so they're very familiar with fear. And some of us really haven't had that much until, it begins to fall away. And then we realize, oh my gosh, we were fearful all the time. What would people think? When am I doing the right thing? How do I get from here to there in a way that's, the best for me? There's all kinds of fear that we sometimes won't even know kind of kept us propped up and going until it begins to let go a little bit.
Yeah.
But I think the piece of our true nature is much more like this contentment. It's okay to be in the moment we're in. It doesn't mean every moment is equally loved by the mind, the conditioned mind. We definitely have preference for pleasure over pain. We're wired that way. But there's an okayness, an acceptance of the moment as it shows up.
Yeah, and ordinary contentment is such a different experience, but also a different story that people could tell about awakening or about enlightenment. It doesn't have that kind of gold medal, win the prize, get superpowers kind of storyline.
Exactly. And we're content to be, an ordinary person, except that you realize that everything that's ordinary is also extraordinary because it's an expression of the truth of being. It's an expression of the divine, if we want to use that word, and so you become fine with, just the simplest things. And at first, that can be a disappointment to the ego that thought it was going to have the gold medal and win the Oscar for enlightenment and all of that.
Yeah, I love that part of your book. That was great.
I remember a moment in my own experience where I said, you mean this is what it's about? Just holding this crying baby or whatever it was. It's like, darn, it wasn't what I thought. But then again, it's so much more liberating when we're not at war. We're not at war with life, And our true nature is not at war with our humanity, and minds are often at war with themselves. I often ask people the question, we have these ideas daily. I like myself, I don't like myself, I'm proud of myself, I'm disappointed in myself, I'm ashamed of myself. Who's the I and who is the myself? I think those are important questions. We just
totally. Yeah, it can feel like we have a cast of characters in our mind, right? Like schizophrenia, right? Like we have all of these parts. It's just that you may be able to differentiate that they're voices in your head and not outside of you. But it's amazing the level of division that we can have amongst these different parts of ourselves. And I think those questions are more powerful than they may even seem when someone first hears or reads them, the types of questions that you're sharing with us, because we don't even recognize the way that we're having so much discourse and counting on the fact that there's an I and a me, as you just shared, as real. And I think until you start to get a little more liberated from the stickiness of these thoughts and the habits, they're like the air you breathe. They're so second nature to you that you really believe that all of your thoughts and feelings have a certain amount of significance to them, or they wouldn't have been thought or felt.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes. Well, and we're not even saying that they're insignificant. It's just a matter of seeing that you yourself are interpreting them however you do, and when you begin to see that there are different interpretations, to the very same experience, or no interpretation at all, and then it just gets to be what it is, it doesn't have to have anything done to it. It's just this moment, then there's tremendous liberation of just being able to live and seeing thoughts for thoughts and feelings for feelings. And I'll put this out there because an awful lot of people on the spiritual journey, and this is a kind of a deep seeing, but I'll share it anyway, would so much rather be a deficient somebody than to look into the fact of maybe being nobody. Do you know? Mm-hmm. Not that there's nobody in mind to honor and respect, but, to look into what's empty, this infinite potential that we are is empty of definition. When the mind looks into emptiness, it gets really scared, like, what does that mean? It means I'm not loved, or I have no worth or purpose or whatever. But, emptiness is just empty of me. It's empty of definition. It's not what the mind thinks it is. And so we spend a lot of time trying to perfect and improve a self in order to someday be worthy to be what we already are. And that's a huge amount of suffering. You talk about this, dialogue we have with ourselves sometimes. And I sometimes think if we had to sit in a restaurant next to two people who were talking the way we talk to ourselves sometimes, we would want to move.
Oh, God.
That would be a very...
More than want to move. Call the police. Sometimes.
Unpleasant meal for sure. And yet we often are dining on those conditioned thoughts. So we need to look into them. Is it really, really true? Can I know that this idea I have about who I am is true? Am I willing to inquire deeply? If we want the truth of it, then we'll be willing to inquire.
Yeah, I think for me, when the awareness of contentment as a foreign planet has been coming to mind, it's because I noticed how attached my idea of myself was to being the deficient somebody, that got to be worked on and made better.
Exactly.
So I think that's an important teaching. And then the other place that our minds can go with that idea of, let's say, ordinary contentment is they'll swing to the opposite end of the spectrum and they'll say, oh, they mean that, enlightenment is becoming that constantly equanimous, placid-faced, desireless, that spiritual person who's just floating on the cloud. And I really appreciated how you kept the pendulum from swinging that way, too. One of the things you wrote that was really beautiful, and I'm quoting you here, is freedom is not found in renouncing desire. Desire leads us to the next moment's unfolding. And I was so glad you brought desire in as a compass. So I was wondering if you could speak to that a bit.
Yeah, my husband and I for many years went to, for a short time, we weren't living in a monastic setting, but we went on retreat there. And my husband was a very humorous guy, and he would talk about the monks and the monkettes, and how they were all trying so hard to look not like they didn't desire anything, and there was no joy There was no joy. But, the Roshi, was full of joy, full of life spirit, full of, when we're trying to plaster over what's real and authentic, it just doesn't work. So, our honesty with ourselves is really an important thing. And to realize that the mind of thought, the egoic identity is never going to be the agent that we hope it will be of love, unconditional acceptance, presence. We have to look in a deeper dimension of ourself for that. And it's not created by ego, and it isn't, it can't actually be created or destroyed. I mean, that's the good news and the bad news. We can't create it and we can't destroy it. The good news, it's already here. So a lot of times we're looking to be a person who's present instead of realizing that there's presence here, no matter what, that notices a person. And so it just kind of flips the switch, 180 degrees, which doesn't mean the person has no importance. It's an expression of the divine. So we can honor ourselves and each other. We can see the ground that we share, and enjoy the fact that there are differences. It's like, a field of wildflowers. They all share the same ground, but they each look different and have their own isness, so to speak, their own beauty. So anyway.
It is interesting how not only may we be caught by our own conditioning, but then all of these spiritual myths that we can absorb or we can create in our own mind. I mean, you had a whole section on spiritual myths, but this image of this desireless, placid person that Brooke was presenting, I mean, I definitely held that image. I definitely was a little bit disappointed as I've come to realize that enlightenment wasn't some exalted state where I was going to have superpowers and never have human feelings, because I was really desperate just to move beyond my own pain. I'm sure that was the mechanism that was operating. And yet, being here now, for example, I love the sound of your voice, Dorothy. That was one of the first things I recognized when I heard you on the Bat Gap interview. And I love the experience of my own aliveness. It's beautiful and it's rich and it's exquisite. And prior to experiencing it, it's funny to notice how afraid we are of all of that. Mm-hmm. And yet, what always reveals itself to me is in the moment when I taste it and touch this kind of truth, it has a beauty about it, like a real welcome, wonderful quality. So it's so fascinating how we hold on to these ideas or these mythologies, and we have all of this, it's seemingly intrinsic fear around being with the mystery that is us. And yet, whenever I taste truth, it's truth, even when it's painful. So it's so fascinating.
Yeah, exactly. No, you've just spoken of it very, very beautifully. The first time that I met Adyashanti one-on-one, he shared with me a line from a Buddhist poem, and one of the lines is to be without anxiety in the face of imperfection. And, it was also about, awakening to the absolute is just halfway around the circle. Now, how does it want to be embodied in these human lives? Because from my perspective anyway, the divine is here having a human experience, whereas we think we're the humans trying to, have the divine. But, when you realize it's all one, there's a single reality here, even though it plays at being two or 10,000 things, in order to see itself, relate to itself, love itself, and so forth. But that whole business, because I too was, very much, this couldn't possibly happen until the self, the idea of a self was perfected, and then when you realize as you have, it isn't about that. It doesn't mean that transformation won't continue. I mean, there's no end to to how the infinite might reveal itself in any of our experiences. So there's always that deepening of it, the embodiment of whatever we've realized. But, I was reminded in the whole being without anxiety in the face of imperfection of this whole philosophy in Japan called wabi-sabi, in which, imperfection and impermanence and all of that is honored. They wouldn't make a tea bowl that was perfect because there was a beauty in the imperfection of it. And I think we're like that too, whatever we might think of as our imperfection is really kind of that unique thing, like, I think I mentioned in the book, like that chipped cup that you keep in your cupboard just because it's, so soulful. There's something so beautiful about it. And when we can begin to look upon ourselves like that, there's this incredible liberation just to be able to be.
Yeah, I feel like culturally we have quite a lot of intolerance for imperfection. It's one of the things we're up against as Westerners and as Americans. And then there's just not a lot of modeling for it,
It's true. And then, to balance the idea, because, an ego will get a hold of this kind of conversation and think, well, anything goes. But that's not what we either, right? I remember a quote from Suzuki Roshi, Zen Buddhist Roshi, and he said to his students at one point, he said, you all are perfect exactly the way you are. And you each could use a little improvement,
That's great.
It's kind of like that, But the improvement doesn't come because we're deficient or unworthy. It comes because we're opening to the deeper dimensions of ourselves that loves, that's at peace, that's at one with its own life.
With that in mind, Dorothy, you had a few beautiful chapters on love, and that section of the book was just really alive for me. I underlined a ton, and there was one line that stood out, and I'm quoting, "Love seems to be the first movement of our true nature." And I guess personally, there's just been a lot of internal exploration around the relationship of love and awakening. Not very conceptual, just maybe a curiosity. And I thought maybe you could share a little bit with our listeners some of your views and experiences on love.
Sure. I mean, it's a word that's fraught with a lot of meaning, different kinds of meaning for different people, isn't it? But yet we feel it when we're in the presence of love, So, my early experiences of both love from and for, were especially with my father. My mother died when I was a child, so my father was the primary parent after that. And then my husband and my children and grandchildren, that felt sense of love when we feel so much the connection that we have with another. But to wake up to this deeper love was a real revelation, because it wasn't just, for a single person. Even though there are those familial relationships that, they hold a little bit different flavor than for others. But I was in a retreat with Adyashanti, and something just popped the heart open, and there was a woman in a wheelchair that was, sitting, meditating in front of where I was sitting, and I fell in love with her and the wheelchair and everything that was around it, and the room and the people, and it was just like, oh my goodness, this is bigger than I ever could have imagined. Or there was another experience that really stands out in my memory. I was sitting in a church listening to a concert, and there was an old man with his arm along the pew in front of where I was sitting, and he had this gnarled old hand, and something was in love with that hand. I mean, it was just so powerful, and it's not something that you can produce, like, okay, now I'm going to fall in love with everything. But I do think when we have a desire to live more and more from the heart, we begin to pay attention. How how does the heart or how does love want to move in this situation? I think in my book I do describe a really simple practice that Adyashanti once offered. It was just saying quietly to yourself, "I love you," before having a conversation. And in beginning to do that, it just sort of expanded, in my experience, beyond the conversation to everything I was seeing. A dandelion in the crack in the sidewalk, or a bottle that was tossed on the street, or a waiter in a restaurant, or whatever, just that quiet "I love you." And so I began to share that with some of my students, as well. And one woman said, I've been trying, affirmations and the years of therapy and all of that to try to be more loving, and this just seemed to open it in an instant, and you don't even have to like the person that you're loving. You don't have to agree with them. But she said it's just so efficient. Now that's not a practice that everyone will feel comfortable doing, but then there are those who said, well, isn't that kind of a fake it till you make it? And I was like, no, because the one who thinks that they're going to be the loving one is not really the source of love. So we're just inviting attention to the love that's already present. From my perspective, it's always inside, just knocking at the door. We think, we want something to come in, but I think love is just knocking on the door inside, just waiting to be let out, just waiting to flow forth, the love that's our true nature. So anyway, those are a few things that come to mind.
That actually lines up. Go ahead, Brooke. No, I was just going to say, describing it that way, the flowing forth. I actually did a online class with Adyashanti about heart opening last year, I guess, and he offered that practice. Saying "I love you" quietly to yourself before you interact with someone. And so I would do it as a practice, and I did find it very immediately helpful, and it really changed my orientation on things. And what I notice now, a year later, is how that practice does itself. Like before my mind can do the practice or think the words. Mm-hmm. And my work, I'm a manual therapist, so I do touch work. Vanessa's more in the psychotherapy realm. So with my clients all the time, it's like when I'm just talking with them when they first arrive or working with, there's just this "I love you," and it's not me doing it. It just flows forward. So I just feel like my job description now is just loving people like crazy all day long.
Well, it's very healing.
To watch it do itself is amazing,
It's an agent of deep, deep healing of separation, isn't it? Because love is, as Nisargadatta said, love is the refusal to separate. And that's beautiful. And so, one man told me about that little practice. He said, I always thought that you had to feel love before you said something like that, but I'm finding that just saying it, opens the heart immediately, and some people will say, well, who's the I and who's the you, and get into a philosophical thing. And those folks could
Spiritual Debate Club.
Those folks could just use the word love, just the reminder that it's already here. It's already here. And we're looking so often in the wrong place for it.
Even as you speak, Brooke and I are smiling, ear to ear, because it feels so good to be in that state. We did this practice as well with a teacher named Matt Kahn, and not only would you whisper "I love you" to yourself, but you put your hands on your heart, which has such a nice, somatic grounding of like touching yourself, and it is such an invitation. And what's amazing is it feels so good.
Yes.
When you're in love, and yet we could be so afraid of it.
Well, we are often afraid of it. We feel like we've been hurt in love, or we're afraid it won't be returned, or we'll feel vulnerable, or whatever. People love the idea of openness when it's this, vast, spacious awareness, da-da-da-da. But when that openness starts moving in the body-mind, it can feel vulnerable because we're no longer, identified with our defenses. And so, it can feel, people can get a little squirrely at first, at least. But you're right. Love feels so much better than judgment. And you know,
yes.
we all know when we're with somebody who just lets us be the way that we are in that moment. You know, there's just a sense of relaxing and of feeling like you don't have to be on guard. Nobody's judging that you should be someplace else. And I think love is what allows that to happen. You know, you mentioned the body work, and for myself, you know, I can always feel if someone has an agenda for the change. You know,
yes, right. What's wrong with your ankle?
Sometimes that works for some people. You know, when my husband was alive, he loved that really deep tissue massage, and so I'm not saying that's true for everyone. I mean, he loved it. But, you know, for me, if somebody has the attitude, and you can feel it immediately, you know, there's a muscle that's tense, and you will open for me. You know?
Right. Why are you tight? What's wrong with you?
And then there's something inside for myself. It's like, I don't think so. You know, it's just like, it's like you feel the agenda to change. And that's why this open-hearted awareness, this open palm, you know, we can say, to just let it be, has such a transforming potential, I think, you know, and it doesn't mean that that I know, you know, what someone else should like or not, or what they need. But for me, you know, love is this feeling in a way that we're just present, you know, we're just present and at one with the moment and with one another, and there's a joy and great satisfaction in that, isn't there?
What's sad, I think, is so many of us may be more familiar with, I guess we could call it agendaed love. I mean, I remember John Wellwood offering a teaching once that was something to the fact of a conditioned personality can't love unconditionally, that's not where unconditional love arises, right? And so many of us in our upbringings or just in the world today are experiencing this very agendaed love, so that A, we can even become afraid of receiving love, and B, I think maybe more problematically, we even turn to ourselves that same way, as you've sort of pointed towards. I mean, we can turn to ourselves with that very sense of agenda, like, okay, great, I see you're sad, cool, okay, but when are you going to stop that? And I thought maybe as part of a follow-up, we could explore a little bit the concept of self-love, because I've had some clients, let's say, whisper I love you to themselves. Most of them in practice find it profoundly opening, but even before, it's like they don't feel like they could say that to themselves. I mean, in our culture, we talk a lot about this idea of self-love. And I was thinking about, well, if we're coming at it from a spiritual perspective, how would we view this movement of self-love? Is it another way we can co-opt it and turn it into ego building? Or are there some benefits to becoming more self-loving?
Well, I would say that, I mean, it's always beneficial to become more self-loving, but the reason that we can't often feel it is because we're trying to love a self conditionally. You know, we're not actually knowing that the self that we truly are, the true self, you know, loves unconditionally. And when you bump up against that, you can't even believe how that's true, that every speck of you is loved. Because every speck of you is that, you know, it's not separate from the source of truth and love. And so I mean, to me, you know, we kind of come back to who is the self we're trying to love, because, you know, I would guess most of us have had very few experiences of unconditional love, and some none at all, sad to say. So all of our experiences have been about love being conditional. So that's what we've learned. We've learned that it's conditional on whether we're a good boy or a good girl, or we've done our homework, or we've practiced the piano, or, you know, whatever it is we were supposed to do, or not have it had an unloving thought, or whatever it is. You know, we've imagined that love depends on some external conditioned way of being. And so we don't know any better. But when you bump up against that deeper dimension of your very self, not someplace else, you begin to open the mind, open the heart, and you see what's there. And maybe at first you'll just find a lot of fear. And so, can we just let that be here in this heart that we share? Can we let fear be here? Can we let, confusion be here? Whatever it is, And so much of our attempt to improve a self is in order to become lovable in our own eyes, right? Mm-hmm. Or worthy in our own eyes. We think it's about being worthy in someone else's eyes, but actually, I think ultimately it's in our own eyes. So we keep looking to someone else to tell us if we're lovable, and that can be a trap. Many people have experienced, when
for sure.
When the goodies aren't coming back, then it means something about me instead of that this relationship wasn't meeting whatever life's needs were. I always think life is moving in service to itself, not in service to a me. But until we know that we are that life, we're going to imagine that it moves for or against a separate me, and that can bring a lot of suffering and confusion.
And then
find out who that self is, and then you may discover that self is already quite in love with its body, mind, expression, and experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have a quote of yours here. Liberation is not liberation from life; it's a liberation to live more fully.
Yes.
And it's so beautifully said. And Vanessa and I have, we always say if we had a mantra, it would just be human. Mm-hmm. Or often just be human. Mm-hmm. And so, in conclusion, we would love to hear from you, what is your sense of what it means to be most fully human?
Well, first, I guess I would say to be fully human is not a state. It's not a state of perfection. It feels to me like it's taking a seat in our true self, really, and then being open to the whole adventure we call life, human life. It includes the wholeness of being, not just one side of duality, the good, the beautiful. We especially in the West, we imagine, that awakened living or full human living would only be, one side of duality. But as long as we're in form and as long as there's a mind that only lives in time, we're going to be in duality. We don't know up without down or health without illness or good without evil. I mean, everything is defining the other, and being part of the wholeness of being. So it's not a state of perfection, but I think that when we know who we and the apparent other truly is, then our relationship with ourselves and one another becomes really infused with that recognition, and it's just a great, great gift to the world. So can we be true to what's true, in ourselves? And each of us will have different relationship with what's true in ourselves, or what path, or what is the passion that we have, for whatever or whomever. Can we allow ourselves to be free, in the sense of following what we love, following that deeply. And we can't all make a living doing that, obviously, but to the extent that we are aligned with a deeper truth, a deeper love, the deeper interest, the deeper passion, I feel like, for some people, who are deeply engaged with science, it's science that takes them beyond themselves, or it could be dance that takes you beyond yourself, or it could be art that takes you, or music, or whatever. That we're here to be who we are, and that's an expression of this mystery that's far beyond anything the mind can conceive of. It's not definable, really. It's like the Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. We can't really give it a name and make it an object because it's who we are. So I think, the more we are in touch with that, with all the dimensions of our being, it's not about just staying in a state. It's returning to our natural state, which is here for everything. It's here for this moment. for this conversation, for whomever, might be listening. It's here for you.
Thank you, Dorothy. Thank you so much for your beautiful work and your teaching and for talking with us today.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. Blessings to you and to the listeners.
Thank you so much for listening to today's show. The show notes, including any resources we mentioned, live at blissandgrit.com. Just go over to the website and scroll down and you'll see each episode's separate post. We put the resources right in there. You can find out more about Dorothy and all of her offerings at dorothyhunt.org. Our member platform is at patreon.com/blissandgrit. You can head over there and donate to us and the show and also get great rewards for your support. If you're wanting to engage with these topics in a deeper way, it's a great place to go for a more immersive experience. You can also come hang with us on Instagram and Facebook. We're Bliss and Grit at both of those spots. We're so grateful for all the reviews so many of you have written, for the membership support so many of you are already providing, and for all the notes you send. We're also deeply grateful to have had Dorothy Hunt on, and we look forward to sharing more again with you next week.